The NATO summit has come and gone. Plenty of discussion about member states committing to spending more on defence and the situation in the Middle East, but without much clarity when it comes to a united vision on how those funds should be spent. Any serious condemnation of Russia was conspicuously absent from the agenda, a tactic some suggest NATO Secretary-General Mark Rutte employed to keep President Trump sweet. But after President Zelensky was granted his wish of a bilateral meeting with his US counterpart, has this week changed anything for Ukraine? We'll be answering your questions on that and plenty more with our expert panel.
I'm Vitaly Shevchenko.
I'm Olga Robinson.
I'm James Waterhouse.
And I'm Jamie Coomarasamy. Welcome to Ukrainecast.
Ukrainecast from BBC News.
Now let's get started straight away with this question from one of our listeners in Scotland.
Hello Ukrainecast, it's Erica from Glasgow speaking. As the NATO summit proceeds in the shadow of Israel and US actions in Iran, I'm wondering if Putin's aims are helped or hindered by extreme volatility in the Middle East. The latest developments come hot in the heels of events in Syria, so I'm thinking particularly of the impact of volatile oil prices and military and strategic support for Russia. Thank you, love the pod.
I wonder who wants to take that on, Olga, perhaps?
Well, my view is that it's not really significantly hindered because the prospect of losing Iran, obviously, as an ally and a supporter for the war in Ukraine, for Russia's efforts in the war, even temporarily, it won't obviously please Moscow. But at the same time, the war effort is no longer relying as much on Iran as it used to, because we know that the Shahed drones are being produced more and more in Russia. And also Russia has other allies like North Korea that it relies on, and China for parts, or like North Korea for people. And plus, I think there's generally, with the US at the moment kind of distracted by Iran, this appears to be kind of somewhat less pressure being put on Russia when it comes to Ukraine settlement compared to even a few weeks ago.
Well, that brings us, of course, to the NATO summit and the lack. I mean, it was striking, wasn't it, Vitaly, that the previous two NATO summits, the communique had started with very explicit reference to Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. That was not there this time. There was reference to supporting Ukraine, to Russia's long-term threat. But what did you make of that?
Well, you asked at the start of this episode whether anything's changed for Ukraine. And I think this summit, at least it hasn't made things worse for Ukraine. No major breakthroughs. But was anyone expecting a major breakthrough at this summit? And I think so much will depend on bilateral agreements between Ukraine and various NATO member states. What they agreed, the increase of their spending on defence to 5% by 2035. And it's 10 years. 10 years is a long time, especially if you're being bombed. So I think more will need to be done to help Ukraine now, and it needs help now. But as I say, at least there's been no major row with anyone.
No major row. I mean, is that a positive to take away? I mean, how's this going to go down in Kyiv, do you think, James?
It's pretty baseline, isn't it, if we're talking about positives? But I think while you've got the NATO members trying to work out how they're going to increase spending, when, increase their industrial base in a military sense, as Vitaly says, you know, if you're Ukraine, I think for Zelensky, it's more about those little sit-downs he can get with Donald Trump, where he can look him in the eye and continue to make his case for continued military support. It clearly went okay, again, off the back of the Pope's funeral, where, you know, Donald Trump was labelling Mr. Zelensky as nice, saying he's, you know, alluding to him being brave and staying the course. And perhaps this...
That is a pretty low baseline when saying someone is nice is a positive, right?
But I think this is also Trump accepting the political reality that actually the Kremlin is not doing anything different. It is not engaging in some kind of ceasefire, but it's still not translating to action.
And also importantly, here we are discussing words and promises of something that will happen in 10 years' time. What Ukraine needs is action. different action, perhaps, than to what its allies have been doing.
There was talk about Patriot missiles, though, wasn't there?
Yes, Donald Trump had this very interesting and emotional exchange with our colleague from BBC Ukrainian, Miroslava Petsa. And he said, well, we're going to see if we can make Patriot air defense missiles available to Ukraine. But again, it's words.
We'll discuss that exchange in a moment, but let's move on to our next question. It's from one of our regular listeners.
Hi, Ukrainecast. This is Susie from Boston, calling in again, this time from my hotel room in Tbilisi, Georgia. Thanks so much for having me back on the podcast. My question is about NATO's European leadership. Given a fickle Trump administration, a lot of people doubt the reliability of America's commitment to Article 5. So aside from increasing defense spending, what steps are European leaders taking to strengthen their leadership in NATO? And then also, I'm wondering if there have ever been any serious attempts or discussions about creating a new parallel alliance that includes Ukraine and is led by European states. Is that something that's ever been on the table? Would that alliance even be effective at deterring Russian aggression? Thank you and keep up the good work.
Thanks for that, Susie. And, well, Vitaly, maybe a more European-led strategy. What do you think?
Do you remember something called Coalition of the Willing? Anyone?
How can we forget?
Why? For one, I've almost forgotten. There was so much talk about it back in March, I think. 20,000 troops from the West possibly being deployed to Ukraine as a tripwire force or a reassurance force, whatever that means. And anything happened? I don't think so. I don't think many people remember those discussions. And that's just an example of how words can fizzle out, how there can be much ado about nothing, and some hope, but that's led to nothing. So how serious the discussions were, well, judge for yourself, Susie.
Is it just a recognition that actually NATO cannot do without America as its leader? I mean, we've seen America's military might being used in the last week or so, of course. This went from, in the old days, it was what can we do about Ukraine? Now it's what can we do about keeping Donald Trump on board? That was the focus of the summit, wasn't it?
It was, but I think if we cast our minds back a few months, you did have European leaders scrambling. There was much more talk about the coalition of the willing. How can we do this without America? Look, Mr. Trump, we're gonna sort our act out. We're gonna end our reliance on you. But clearly, with this summit this time around, I think there is a bit of relief, dare I say, that the White House hasn't pulled the rug in that sense. And so actually it's about accommodating America where possible, rather than the awkward position of having to come up with a military solution without actually having the capability as a European ally.
But at the same time, on the ground for Ukrainians, nothing changes, because in the past week alone, we have seen two major, really deadly strikes by Russia on Kyiv and in Dnipro, and with loads of people dead, lots of people injured.
So I expect the feeling in the Kremlin will be, yeah, you keep on talking, we'll just carry on in Ukraine.
Well, let's turn to another question now. This came in from Chris from Woking. He asked, most of the people I speak to despise Donald Trump because of his lack of moral compass. But are we being fair to him? He has persuaded NATO countries to spend more on defence. He has done his best to end the war in Ukraine, although not succeeded. And as of today, seems to have ended Iran's quest for an atomic bomb. Compared with other presidents, are we being fair?
There are questions about that Iran nuclear capabilities. Still, we're very early days with that, and I think it's too early to draw conclusions, really. But when it comes to Ukraine, from where I'm sitting as a person who constantly is dealing with footage from the front line and footage of aftermath of attacks in Ukraine pretty much on a daily basis, I literally have, while all these diplomacy is going on, I literally have noticed zero changes in the kind of footage that we are seeing, apart from a temporary dip in Ukrainian drone attacks on Russian oil depots and some of the military infrastructure and industrial infrastructure. And we're starting to see some of the attacks again. But it's just overall, I've never actually noticed any any difference?
All this time, I tried really hard to avoid discussing the moral side of the issue, and it's huge, this issue. And sticking to the facts, when talking about what Donald Trump has been saying and doing about Ukraine, he accused Ukraine of starting this war repeatedly. He basically equates Russia and Ukraine. He doesn't speak in terms of one is aggressor, the other is a victim of aggression. So these are the things that I think our listeners can form their own opinion about, but these are the issues that deserve to be talked about.
What about Donald Trump's actions? He promised during his election campaign he was going to be a peacemaker, but he wasn't going to commit American troops. He wasn't going to get involved in foreign wars. He's got involved in the Iran-Israel war. He did get involved diplomatically when India and Pakistan had their brief conflict a couple of months ago. He's engaged with Putin, whatever that's brought. What do you think, James?
I think all US presidents are going to be guided by a compass of sorts. I think with Donald Trump, whether it's a moral one or otherwise, it's hard to work out. Let's put it like that.
Peace through strength.
Peace through strength is clearly his driver here. He does want to end wars, and he wants to end wars quickly. And remember, under the Biden administration, the constant frustration in Ukraine, whether you spoke to soldiers, whether you spoke to people on Independence Square in Kyiv, it was the pace and scale of American help that made Ukrainians pull their hair out, because there would be Western wariness. Zelensky would call for more. The West would eventually yield and provide missiles or tanks or even fighter jets. And there was a hope when Donald Trump took office that actually he would be more decisive when it came to military aid. Unfortunately for Ukraine, he's proven to be so keen to remove himself from the moral argument around this war, to not take sides, to try and bring Russia and Ukraine to some kind of ceasefire. And, as Vitaly says, that has often seen him take a more sympathetic tone even with Moscow rather than Kyiv.
Another way of putting it, you say, removed himself from the moral argument. I think what we're seeing is a shift from a policy largely based on values towards a policy that's heavily based on interests. At any rate, how those interests are seen in Washington.
Well, let's just watch something rather interesting that came out of the NATO summit, something that showed perhaps a different side of Donald Trump to the one we're used to seeing, certainly in that public setting, in the setting of a news conference at least. This was his exchange between with our BBC Ukraine colleague Miroslava Petsa.
Where are you from? I'm from Ukraine.
Oh,
so my question to you is whether or not the US is ready to sell anti-air missile systems Patriot to Ukraine. We know that Russia has been pounding Ukraine really heavily right now.
Are you living yourself now in Ukraine?
My husband is there.
Wow.
And
I can see you're very, it's amazing.
And me with the kids, I'm in Warsaw actually, because he wanted me to be.
Is your husband a soldier? No?
He's
there now?
Yeah.
Wow. That's rough stuff, right? That's tough. And you're living here?
In Warsaw.
And you're a reporter?
I am.
Good. So let me just tell you, they do want to have the missiles, okay, as they call them, the Patriots. And we're going to see if we can make some available, They're very hard to get. We need them too. We were supplying them to Israel. And they're very effective, 100% effective. Hard to believe how effective. And they do want that more than any other thing, as you probably know. That's a very good question, and I wish you a lot of luck. I mean, I can see it's very upsetting to you. So say hello to your husband, okay? Thank you.
What did you make of that, Vitaly?
I found it unusual. A show of some emotion on Donald Trump's part that was somewhat positive towards Ukraine. That is unusual, I think.
But America is not selling Patriot missile systems to Ukraine. There was once talk of it, but when you speak to ministers, they are not playing ball at all. And as things stand, with no more military aid being signed off by the White House, that ammunition that trickles through over the Polish border, that is going to run out over the next few weeks. That is what we are being told in the corridors of power. So yes, it's a sympathetic moment, and it is undeniably a moment with Miroslava there. But if we're going to keep talking about actions, America is not. It's not just not providing missile systems; they're not selling them.
And also diverting some of those systems, or they have diverted them to the Middle East after the start of this crisis. So that's another impact of Iran and Israel on Ukraine.
I just wonder, Olga, Donald Trump coming face to face with a colleague whose husband is on the front line, being confronted with sort of the reality of someone's life and seeing the emotion there. I mean, do you think that has an impact? Someone who's shielded from that.
I think President Trump generally, he knows a good TV moment as well. So maybe a cynic in me looks at this as something that he would know, that loads of cameras there, people are watching, it's a humanized moment that will be picked up by other people. So,
well, look, let's turn to something else Donald Trump has become known for, not just TV moments, but setting deadlines. Because, of course, the day one deadline, he was going to fix Ukraine. He said on the campaign trail there was a 100-day deadline. And Doug has got in touch with a question about the latest of those deadlines. And this is what he says. He says, I'm wondering about the 2-week deadline that Trump gave Putin to respond with some sort of proposal to have a ceasefire. It seems like it's another example of Trump's inability to complete anything where Russia is involved, or it's an example of his capricious mind. Of course, he gave the Iranians a 2-week deadline, but he didn't wait that long, did he? 2 days, I think, until he started bombing the nuclear sites. What do you make of the 2-week deadline that's come and gone?
I think it's just generally, it's Trump's modus operandi. Just it's negotiating tactic in a way, this setting deadlines and red lines and whatnot. And I think, as Vitaly's rightly saying, like ultimatums and deadlines normally with the Kremlin don't really work that well, because they either ignore them, or they just say, well, we don't care, we're just going to carry on as we do.
And missed deadlines are an invitation to continue.
But there is a bit of a disagreement as well, because Zelensky said he spoke to Donald Trump about a ceasefire, and the Trump camp are saying no such thing was discussed. So we're no clearer in that front either.
Are we any clearer where the talks are at the moment?
They're nowhere, to be frank, Jamie, because you've got... yes, continued prisoner of war exchanges, and they are not to be dismissed, but they have been the sole area of cooperation throughout this war. But as of where there could be a compromise, where where the conflict could be frozen in any way, there is simply no agreement. You have Russia laying out its continued maximalist demands over the stationing of foreign troops in Ukraine, for example, the size of Ukraine's military, the leadership of Ukraine. It's not backing down on that front. And if we are going to look at action, the numbers of drones and missiles that are slamming into cities now is unlike anything I've seen. And this is not a tide towards some kind of pause.
And Moscow said earlier this week they're not discussing the memoranda about peace in Ukraine with Kyiv at the moment.
OK, well, let's turn away from headline diplomacy from just a moment. Let's take another listener question.
Hello, Ukrainecast. This is Ian in Poland. Quick question for you about war crimes. I still hear journalists talk about war crimes being committed in Ukraine. But what do they mean these days, given that there are so many of them that have been carried out over the last 3 years? Will Putin ever be held accountable for these war crimes? And if so, do they kind of stack up against him and just add to whatever sentence or fine might come his way in the end? And, what's the chances of that ever happening? Is it sensible to even talk about war crimes anymore?
Thanks for that, Ian. Olga, perhaps one for you.
I think, well, it's an open question whether Vladimir Putin will ever be held accountable. I mean, he's not going to BRICS summit in Brazil because there is a warrant for his arrest from ICC over kidnapping of Ukrainian children. But Russia genuinely has been pretty much like ignoring all the accusations, genuinely always said that they don't commit war crimes in Ukraine. But I think it's very important to almost like differentiate or bring in another element to this. It's not just Putin when it comes to war crimes. It's what we are seeing from emerging from the front lines very often is ordinary Russian soldiers, mercenary Russian soldiers, people who fight for Russia. And there's loads of visual evidence, and it's extremely difficult to investigate.
When it comes to war crimes, of course, it's only a court or a tribunal that can prove or establish that a crime or a war crime has been committed. But as Olga says, evidence suggesting that Russian forces have been committing them in Ukraine on a huge scale, that evidence is overwhelming. Execution of prisoners of war, targeting civilian areas indiscriminately with cluster munitions as well, targeting rescue workers, medical workers, double tap attacks as well, forcing residents of occupied areas to join Russian forces. That's a war crime too. And speaking of tribunals, on his visit after the NATO summit yesterday, on Tuesday, Volodymyr Zelensky signed an agreement setting up the foundations of a tribunal for the crime of aggression in Ukraine, which is a step towards holding Vladimir Putin and his associates accountable. But so much will need to happen before he's captured. People are saying, Milosevic didn't expect to be tried and be put in the dock for his alleged crimes. But that tribunal for Yugoslavia, there's a huge difference. Milosevic was arrested by Yugoslav authorities, and that tribunal was established by the UN Security Council. There's no hope that this UN Security Council will establish such a tribunal for Ukraine.
And Russia, of course, has denied all allegation of war crimes or indeed targeting civilians. But, James, I wonder, in Ukraine, the work goes on. The forensic work goes on, does it, in documenting everything that has happened?
Absolutely. I mean, it goes in tandem with the kind of PR game as well. You know, whenever there is a missile strike on a residential block, you know, the emergency services, the government have a very slick, sophisticated system of getting the images out there to news organisations like us to try and shine a light where they can. But I remember, I mean, it's always been important to Ukraine to document the way Russia prosecutes its invasion. I remember going to the trial of a young Russian soldier called Vadim Shishimarin. I'll never forget it. And he shot an elderly man dead as they advanced or tried to advance on Kyiv in 2022. Those kind of cases are rare. There are hundreds of cases in the pipeline. But what struck me then was actually it's not just about fighting this war for Ukraine. It's also about documenting.
James, thank you very much. Olga too, and as ever, Vitaly. And thank you for watching. We'll be back with a new Q&A episode next week. But in the meantime, why don't you check out the Ukrainecast feed, where there is plenty more analysis on the key moments throughout the war, including big interviews with the people and players on the ground. And if you like the sound of that, just search for Ukrainecast wherever you get your BBC podcasts, and make sure you click subscribe so you never miss an episode. See you soon. Goodbye.
Ukrainecast from BBC News.